C-355, an act to prohibit the export by air of horses for slaughter and to make related amendments to certain acts. I would now like to welcome the sponsor of the bill, no stranger to this committee, Mr. Lewis, the MP for Kitchener-Conestoga. Tim, Mr. Lewis, good to see you. Of course, this is traditionary where we have an hour of opening panels from the private sponsors, so I'm going to allow you to make an opening statement. And then, colleagues, we are pushed a little bit. I'm going to try to go till about 1:10 or 1:15, which should give us at least 2 rounds, if not more, to ask Mr. Lewis questions, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so Mr. Lewis, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. It feels great to be here in this room, but in a different chair. And also, I'm honored to be here in Ottawa as I appear before you on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. And also, today we're celebrating Canadian Agricultural Day, in celebration of the hardworking farmers who feed us. So I'm honored to appear before you, my colleagues in Agriculture Committee, to speak on behalf of my private member's bill, C-355, which aims to prohibit the export of live horses for slaughter by air. As a member of Parliament and a Canadian who values our special relationship with horses, I bring forth this bill, convinced that this practice must come to an end. It's time to Canada to join other countries that have already banned the export of live horses for slaughter. Horses hold a revered place in Canada's history, serving as steadfast companions in our fields and communities. From Mennonite families in my community relying on horses for traditional transportation and for farming to this day, to the iconic images of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, our bond with these majestic animals is deeply ingrained in our national identity. Every year in Kitchener-Conestoga in the township of Wilmot, our community hosts the New Hamburg Fall Fair, and the first event of the fair is always the draft horse pull event, where the strength and grace of these majestic animals are showcased. These are the same breeds of horses that are being exported for slaughter by air to be eaten raw as a high-end delicacy. However, despite our reverence for horses, thousands are exported by air annually for slaughter, subjected to distressing conditions during transportation. It's unacceptable that these intelligent and sensitive companion animals endure such suffering, especially considering their significant roles in our history and our society. Having engaged in consultations with stakeholders, I've worked hard to understand various perspectives. Bill C-355 specifically targets the export of live horses for slaughter by air, reflecting our commitment to animal welfare, while also acknowledging the importance of farming communities feeding Canadians. Bill C-355 is a standalone piece of specific legislation that will not disrupt other livestock sectors, but focuses solely on banning the export of live horses for slaughter by air. With approximately 2,600 Canadian horses exported for slaughter by air annually, this practice constitutes a relatively small industry. Most exports originate from Western Canada, with horses raised on feedlots before enduring long journeys in cramped conditions. With regards to the timeline to implementation, the bill allows for an 18-month implementation period to align with a natural lifespan of horses raised for slaughter. This 18-month timeline strikes the balance between practical considerations and the commitment to ending this practice as soon as possible. Since the beginning of this practice, I've worked inclusively, considering perspectives of stakeholders from various backgrounds. The bill has garnered support from both sides of the House, reflecting a shared belief in the importance of stopping the practice of exporting live horses for slaughter by air. Canadians overwhelmingly support this initiative. In conclusion, let's work together across party lines and put an end to this cruel practice. I thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. We'll get right to that. We're going to start with Mr. Barlow for up to 6 minutes. Over to you, Mr. Barlow.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Lewis, thanks for your presentation. Can you tell me what current laws through the Health of Animals Act or the International Air Transport Association Act, what regulations or laws are the current shippers and exporters breaking?
I don't have those laws in front of me, so I cannot.
That's because they're breaking none of the current laws. In fact, they are exceeding them quite handily. In fact, do you know the International Air Transportation Association regulations on the size of the crates that horses specifically should have on air transportation? Do you know the size of those crates through the IATA regulations?
I do. I know that the horses are shipped in containers that are actually smaller than a single stall for a horse.
Well, in
usually.
fact, the regulations for the IATA requires a 1,300-pound horse to have about 14.2 square feet. Currently, the transportation crates used by Canada are almost twice that much at 22.85 square feet, so they're actually exceeding international rules. Is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency present to inspect each load of horses before transportation?
The Canadian Food Inspection Agency is present until wheels up and the plane takes off.
So if they are being inspected to ensure they meet all the rules, what rules are being broken that would bring the necessity to go forward?
I have respect for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the work on food safety that they do, the work on animal health, the work on plant health, and they're going to be here to speak about that bill. They've appeared at this committee many times. I look forward to their
So
contributions.
are they breaking any laws by the CFIA standards?
We'll determine that when they get here. We've got witnesses that are coming with various degrees of opinions.
So in your actual wording of your bill, you're saying that horses are being cramped and uncomfortable, wounded, injured, and fatalities. But clearly, they're exceeding all of the international and Canadian laws in terms of transportation regulations that are in place. CFIA is there inspecting every single load before it is wheels up, as in your wording. So they're not breaking any current laws, which I find interesting of why you're bringing this bill forward if it really is about air transportation. Since the last time the rules have been adjusted in 2014, how many horse fatalities have occurred since 2014? In air transportation specifically? How many fatalities?
How many fatalities have occurred? Yeah. I know that the science we're going to bring people that explain. I don't see how many.
Zero fatalities since 2014. Mm-hmm. Do you know the frequency?
I actually have data that says there were fatalities in 15 and 17, I believe.
Well, according to our own Canadian statistics and the CFIA, the answer is zero. What is the frequency of injured animals on air transportation? Do you know?
I have that number somewhere. But
less than 1%.
Right.
How many stakeholders did you consult with in terms of? Have you consulted with the CFIA? Yes or no?
Yes.
Have you consulted with Canadian Border Services Agency?
I believe we are in touch with them as well. Mm-hmm.
The Airline Pilots Association?
We have reached out to them.
Reached out, so have you consulted with them?
I haven't heard them from
back
from them.
CBSA, so you reached out, but have they answered back?
We have, my staff, I believe, is talking to them as well.
So about close to half of the breeders and you said this is a minor industry. It's minor maybe for you, but not for the folks who are actually in this industry. It's actually a massive part of their livelihood. And I want to read a portion of a letter from members of the Métis Nation of Alberta. There has been no consultation with Indigenous producers and people on the plant to ban the export of live horses. Banning the export of meat horses would be extremely effective if the federal government would like to again shackle Indigenous farmers. For us, the horse meat industry has given us a financial boost to our farming practices, as well as the ability to embrace our Métis traditions and culture. How many members of the Métis Nation across Canada did you consult with before putting this bill forward?
I have had conversations with individuals, and we have meetings set up with, I believe, the Métis Nation of Alberta as well.
How many of them were supportive of this bill?
I have talked to some who are, some who aren't, and I want to say that this bill is a standalone bill that will not stop breeding of horses. It will not stop the sale of horses. This is simply stopping the export of live horses before slaughter by air.
Which is a significant part of the industry. You mentioned in the Amish horses in your riding. What do those owners of those horses do at the end of the lifespan of the horse?
The export for horses for slaughter is not about the end of life of a horse. This is about raising horses, specifically fattening them up to be used as raw, like sushi, for overseas. So that is not the same. It's false comparison.
What is the percentage of the population globally that still relies on horse meat as a key part of their protein diet?
Again, this is not about horse meat consumption. It's not about the sale of horse meat or even raising and breeding horses for consumption here. It's about, this is simply ending the cruel practice of exporting live horses to another country to be eaten raw as a delicacy.
Well, it's 16%. So in your bill, you're worried about the time that horses are transported by air. Do you know the hours that we're allowed to transport cattle in Canada? How many hours is this allowable?
We've had that discussion. I believe is it 28, I believe?
It's 33.
33?
What does the law allow in air, how many hours for air transport for horses? Do you know?
That's 28 hours.
28. What is the average air time that they're in the air going from Canada to Japan, for example?
We'll have witnesses come and talk about that. There are some that are under, and there are some instances where they went over the 28 hours.
There's one instance where they went over 28, and that was for weather. They stopped in Seattle. Average is 23. So again, they're below industry standards. The fatality rate is 0. The injury rate is less than 1%.
Mr. Barlow, I apologize. We're at time,
Thanks,
and I
Mr.
want to make sure we have enough room. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. We'll now turn to Mr. Kerr.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. I want to take the opportunity just to begin here in thanking my colleague for bringing this important piece of legislation forward. You know, we often live and talk about the Ottawa bubble, and what that means is that there are issues here that sometimes consume a lot of our energy and our time and our focus that are disassociated with the things that people on the ground really care about. My colleague, Mr. McGregor, our colleague, received over 36,000 signatures to a petition in support of the objective of this legislation. In my constituency office, I'm told that we are getting 30 emails about every minute right now, which puts us over 10,000 in the course of the last couple of days. Now, I know that my conservative colleagues like to refer to this as pandering to activists. I do take some exception to the demonization of activists as somehow being flawed in their pursuit of better treatment of animals, but that aside, I don't understand how it is that we can characterize the voice of tens of thousands of Canadians that have been expressed through the democratic process as simply being chalked up to some form of extreme activism. The job of a member of parliament is to reflect the views of their constituents back to folks that do business here in Ottawa. And I respect the fact that Mr. Barlow and my conservative colleagues are, I think, genuinely doing that, reflecting concerns raised by those they represent. I'm doing the same thing, as I believe Mr. Lewis is, Mr. McGregor, and others. When I campaigned during the by-election we held in Winnipeg South Centre in June of this past year, I heard about this issue more than any other that was raised by people at the door and in my office who wanted to see action on something that mattered to them. In part, that is because my riding is not too far from Richardson International Airport in Winnipeg, where a large number, as we know, of these horses are sent for slaughter. I do also have a couple of concerns or perhaps just curiosities about rationale used by my conservative colleagues in particular in opposition to this bill. I did hear my colleague Mr. Barlow talk about the fact that there were no rules broken, therefore why bring forward legislation? I'm not sure that the purpose of legislation is always to respond to a broken rule. Conservatives are bringing forward legislation as it pertains to a price on pollution. I'm not sure that's breaking any rule, but they brought forward legislation that they want to see bring changes to that. I'm also not really hearing Mr. Lewis talk a lot or others talk about broken rules as much as I'm talking about the core of this issue, which is that these are sentient beings that under current regulations, even if rules are not being broken, is not in line with the values that we believe we should have as Canadians. I also don't quite understand the point raised about death and always coming back to minimal numbers of deaths. Of course, assuming that the statistics are true, and I've read them, I have no reason to believe that they're not, that there's a minimal number of deaths. That's like saying if somebody hits a dog but the dog doesn't die, we don't need to worry about it. If somebody abuses a child emotionally, but there's no physical or fatal consequence as a result of that abuse, that it's not something that we should be talking about. So the point I'm simply raising is that just because the horses aren't dying in transport does not justify that the provisions currently in place are good. I know that my conservative colleagues, much like I think many of us, like to be rooted in evidence, and the evidence certainly suggests, Mr. Lewis, that this is a priority for many Canadians. And I don't depreciate the significant concern that is coming from some folks that my colleagues represent, but that does not mean that there aren't tens of thousands or millions of people across the country who feel differently. And I think sometimes that's being left out of the conversation. I do note that in a comment that was made by our colleague from Dauphin Swan River, Neepawa, during debate on this not too long ago, that he accused the Liberals as attempting to score cheap political points on the basis of this legislation. With the 30 seconds I have left, Mr. Lewis, I think it's 30 seconds, 45 maybe, can you tell us why you brought this bill forward and why you believe, if you do, that the feedback you've received and that we've received from tens of thousands of Canadians is legitimate? Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to answer, and Winnipeg Humane Society has been a strong advocate for banning this practice, and I have to say thank you because your name comes up when we have those conversations as someone who's behind this, so they're lucky to have you, and I appreciate that. The vast majority of Canadians in all provinces, all political stripes, they want to see this practice. Just recently heard from someone in Foothills, Alberta, with Mr. Barlow's own riding, who wants to ban this practice. So this is not some niche issue. This is not urban versus rural. This is not about going against agriculture. This is about banning a practice that's already been banned in other countries, and more countries are working toward this. It's about banning a cruel practice of shipping horses live by plane across the world to be eaten as a delicacy. And I take offense by the member's description of being called niche. This is not niche. This is compassionate. This is Canadian. And we're getting people from all across the country asking us to stand up and do the right thing. And I think that's what we're doing.
Thanks,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Lewis. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Kerr. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Maintenant, Monsieur Parent, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup,
Now,
Monsieur le
Mr.
Président.
Parent, 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Lewis, for being available. I know you're always here, but it's in a different way this time. So, do you have the interpretation? Good. So, Mr. Lewis, I'm going to start by asking you quite simply, if these conditions, from what I understand from your bill, because there are people, or you consider that the transportation conditions of horses for slaughter are improper. So Mr. Barlow earlier asked a good series of questions on the regulations. They're not being broken. So is the solution not instead to review the conditions of transport? That's my first question. Thank you for the question.
Parler français.
I wanted to speak French, but
I need the time. Next time, promise. I appreciate that concern. We'll bring in witnesses. We'll talk to people about the condition that the horses have from being raised in those feedlots all the way up to transportation. The conditions that these horses are companion animals different from other livestock, and certainly are not treated the same as horses for racing or any other causes. This is a niche market that can be improved, and there are examples of injuries and deaths.
C'est quoi, Monsieur Lewis, les différences?
Mr. Lewis, what is the difference? What are the differences between the transportation of horses for slaughter compared to horses for racing or for sale, quite simply, to a customer outside of Canada?
Right. The horses are raised for sport, are trained and habituated to travel, where these horses are not. Those horses that are raised for sport are supervised during the flight itself, and these horses that are raised and exported for slaughter are definitely not. The horses that are raised for sport are also given more space to move within their crates to correct their balance during takeoff and landing, and that's one of the primary possible injuries.
Donc, vous me dites que les conditions de transport ne sont pas tout à fait identiques.
When you
que-
say that the conditions are not identical, there's more supervision and more space for horses that are used for other purposes than slaughter. You're talking about competition horses. I understand that there's an approach there. And the other thing is, wouldn't it be quite simply to change the transportation conditions to adapt it to what is done when you transport a horse for competition? That's my first question. And the second question is, are there a horse that is being sold for other purposes than slaughter, but not for competition? What are their conditions of transport?
I would imagine we would have to ask the exporters if they would be willing to improve those conditions. That's a question for them. I did have meetings with the exporters themselves. We had good conversations, and I heard their concerns, and that's what we're here to do. We're here to hear each other's concerns. I would imagine it comes down to cost. When you're talking about racehorses, those are high-end horses that are treated much differently than basically these being treated the way these horses that are exported for slaughter are. As far as the second question, I'm trying to keep up, please.
Donc, on imagine, on va avoir des spécialistes qui vont nous revenir là-dessus plus tard. C'est ce que vous
So
me
we'll
répondez.
have some specialists talking about this a little later on. So you've also mentioned in your bill the necessity of having a certificate so that the exporter be able to justify the export of a horse and to attest that it's not for slaughter, because your bill is only regarding slaughter. So we are many of us consider horses to be noble and valuable creatures, but we also have to think of the impact of any given bill. So those who are transported for other reasons than slaughter, you talk about a certificate for the exporters. But first of all, have you considered the administrative burden from all the different people involved? And once arrived at destination, that would mean that the owner of that horse, once the beast will be at the end of life, will not be able to slaughter it. How do you reconcile this? Because there will be various periods of time happening.
I've reached out, I've spoken to many stakeholders, and we want to minimize any of those unintended consequences related to any changes in this policy or law. Most of the groups that I spoke to, the racetrack associations and those others, they understand the bill and they're behind the spirit of the bill. These are groups whose primarily they're concerned that they wanted to make sure that there's no correlation between their industries and the exporters sending horses for slaughter. So these are two completely different industries. We're going to make sure that we minimize any kind of extra burden on those industries, and we want to hear from them, and we want to work within this committee to see if we can come up with solutions. But right now, this is, I believe, is a solution that is a standalone bill that will not affect any other livestock, and it's also a bit of a reverse onus saying, if you're proving that you're not sending this horse for slaughter, which is a vast difference, there's not much difference between getting on a plane for one horse that's traveling for a show or go over for a coronation in England versus these horses which are crammed in crates and flown over.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Thank you, Mr. Parral. We'll now turn to Mr. McGregor for up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Mr. Lewis, taking a different seat around the committee this time. Yes, as Mr. Carr mentioned, e-petition 4190, it received 36,175 signatures. It certainly did generate a lot of interest, and my office too, given that I'm the NDP's agriculture critic, we are receiving a considerable amount of correspondence on this bill and this measure. So it is clear that there is a considerable amount of interest among the Canadian population for this measure. I'm curious, though, when we started this parliament, we did have a different Minister of Agriculture, the Honourable Marie-Claude Bibeau, and in her mandate letter was a clear direction from the Prime Minister to enact this kind of policy. During the number of times that she appeared before our committee to defend the estimates for her departmental spending, I took that opportunity to ask her a number of times on how she and her department were progressing on that mandate letter from the Prime Minister. And her constant refrain was that they were working on it, more consultations were needed. So similar to Mr. Carr's question on the journey that led you to developing this PMB, I'd like to know a little bit more about that, but also what kind of collaboration have you had with the department? Have they offered you access to the consultations they provided? Because I know the resources of a member of parliament compared to an entire department, there's a considerable difference there. So have you been able to piggyback on AAFC's consultations on this particular policy item?
Thank you for the question through the chair. You've been a big part of getting it this far. I think that it's that public opinion of once people know about this cruel practice, they don't want to see Canadians, Canada take part in this. So a big part of the grassroots movement of that was to have voices heard. So by you sponsoring petition 4190, I think it is, that brought it to the forefront. And there have been advocates that are saying that. The fact that you sit on the Agriculture Committee, the fact that I sit on the Agriculture Committee also, I think, shows that this is not any kind of attack on livestock farming, on the agriculture sector as a whole. This is a specific bill, and that's why I did it as a standalone bill, not to in any way encroach on other legislation. This is a very specific bill for a specific purpose. As far as why I took this on, well, as you and I know, and I would say for those listening, is that we end up with getting a lottery number for a private member's bill. And in the previous parliament, I had one that wasn't worth looking into. This one I did, and it took a little while, and this was something that I wanted to do, and I heard from people. I have been in touch with the department. I don't know how much, like they didn't just hand over a file to me and say, here's where we're at. I know that they were working toward that. I just saw an opportunity to get this done faster. And there's no difference between a private member's bill or a government-sponsored bill. The legality of it is the same, and so I would still love any input from anybody.
Sure. Yeah. No, I was just curious about the process involved, and it's good to hear that you've been in consultation with the department. I think we're going to have a chance to hear directly from them as well. And the other thing I also want to be clear, so on close reading of your bill, this bill, am I correct in reading, it is not about stopping the raising of horses for human consumption. This is really just targeted on the mode of transport. Yes? Sorry.
Yes, it is. This is not going to stop horse breeding. This is not going to stop horse selling. We have horse abattoirs.
And given that there is in some parts of the world they do enjoy the fresh horse meat as a delicacy. Sometimes it's consumed raw. It's a cultural thing. We're not here to pass judgment on that. But given that this is not about banning the raising of horses for human consumption in Canada, do you think there may be some more opportunities to increase local processing and better economic opportunities that result from that in Canada? If we were to ban the export and the transportation of live horses, does that give rise to maybe more processing happening in Canada? Is that yeah.
That's certainly a possibility. You and I have both sat on this committee and studied processing, and especially through pandemic, we saw that is a bit of a choke point to get food from farm to table. So, but to reiterate your point, this is not stopping domestic consumption of horse. This would not stop the selling and breeding of horses, and nor do we have any jurisdiction of what other countries are eating or doing. That's not about this. This is, again, cultural respect everywhere. This is simply banning the export of live horses for slaughter.
And my final question, I do note that Senator Pierre Delfond has Bill S-270, which he introduced last year. Did you have any conversations with Senator Delfond, and how did you come to the conclusion to draft your bill the way it is compared to how he drafted his bill?
It was a bit of a horse race.
Yeah, there's so many.
It was. You know what? We were both moving around at the same time, and I just got there first. We have had conversations. We even sit on another committee together. So he's been very helpful, and I'm still keeping him in the loop. And we just kind of approached it from a slightly different way. But I wanted to make sure my bill was a standalone bill that didn't affect any other livestock or any other production.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to leave it at that. We'll go to Mr. Steinley for up to 5 minutes.
I'd really like to begin where Mr. McGregor left off. you just said this is not about banning the consumption of horse meat domestically. Your colleague, Mr. Carr, has talked about horses being sentient beings, and Canadians believe, in lots of correspondence he has received, is about treating horses with respect and dignity they deserve. So I'd like you to tie those two positions together, because many of the emails I've received, like Mr. Carr has said, is about stopping the consumption of horse meat. So I want to make it clear, you just said that is not the aim of your bill.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, and I appreciate all the people writing to you to ask to end this practice. This is not. This is a standalone bill that is just simply banning the export of horses for live or slaughter.
So with all the people that have sent in emails to stop the production of horse meat and stop the consumption of horse meat, will you be responding to them saying that is not the point of this bill? This bill is to stop the transportation of horses by air to other countries for consumption.
I appreciate the question, and I appreciate you understanding the nuance of that. That is exactly what the bill says it's going to do. I wanted to be specific because that would be the best way to get the most support, and that's what we said we do, and I'm going to do it.
So just to go back to Mr. Carr's comments, because many of the people that he represents wants this practice completely banned. So are you and Mr. Carr not on the same page then of what this bill is supposed to be doing?
When I set out to draft this private member's bill, it was to ban the practice of exporting horses, live horses, for slaughter. That's the intention of the bill, and that's what we're working on and talking about right here.
Okay, well, thank you very much for clarifying that. I guess I do have a list of stakeholders who do not support Bill C-355, and it's something I'd like to put into the record because some of my colleagues have said this is a pan-Canadian approach. There's lots of people across the country that are in favor of this, but there are lots of groups that have questions and concerns about this. So the list includes the Airline Pilots Association of Canada, Alberta Auction Markets Association, Alberta Beef Producers, Alberta Breeders Finance, Alberta Grazing Leaseholder Association, Beef Farmers of Ontario, British Columbia Cattlemen's Association, Canadian Cattlemen's Association, Canadian Equine Exporters Association, Canadian Meat Council, Canadian Federation of Agriculture, Egg Farmers of Alberta, Equestrian Canada, Feeder Association of Alberta Limited, Horse Welfare Alliance of Canada, Livestock Markets Association of Canada, Les Producteurs de Bovins de Quebec, Manitoba Beef Producers, members of the Métis Nation of Alberta, New Brunswick Cattle Producers, Nova Scotia Cattle Producers, Saskatchewan Cattle Producers, Spruce Metals, Prince Edward Island Cattle Producers, Western Cash Advanced Programs, Inc., Western Stock Growers Association. My question is, how many of these groups have you discussed and heard what their concerns are when it comes to Bill C-355?
I appreciate that list. That sounds like it's a very thorough list, and I would have conversations. I've had conversations with some. I would appreciate any of those organizations reaching out to any one of us. That's our job here in committee, is to hear from stakeholders and have those conversations, bring those ideas forward and debate them. So I think...
Thank you. And just to get back to one of the comments that Mr. Carr made when he talked about sentient beings. So I think one of the fears people have is, what's next? If we go after what people decide to eat, are cattle next? Are hogs next? Are chickens next? So I think that's the fear of the slippery slope that some of these stakeholders that have very real concerns about where we're going right now, that would be their concern. And I'm just going to end with this. Did you talk to FCC? Have they confirmed, because they do have borrows directly that are horse breeders, 40% which are Indigenous, I might add. Farm Credit Canada has confirmed that their clients who operate in the horse industry have borrowed since 2008. If people's livelihoods are prohibited by this law and it's carried through, FCC could be considered a public expense if they no longer are able to pay their debts. So how much money would the taxpayers be on the hook for paying out these horse breeders if this bill goes forward? What's the cost to the Canadian taxpayer?
I appreciate the question, and this bill will not ban breeding or selling of horses. this bill will ban the exporting of those horses to be slaughtered in another country.
Which
but
kneecaps the
that
industry,
is
right?
not going to stop this industry from happening. And to answer the other, let me see what your other question was now. Oh, you talked about slippery slope.
Will
It
there be
would-
compensation
yes.
through FCC?
You talked about the slippery slope, but I've already answered the fact that this will not affect the domestic meat industry. And so that is not a slippery slope. This is a standalone bill on purpose to make sure that that does not happen.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Thank you, Mr. Steinley. We'll now turn to Ms. Taylor-Roy for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Lewis, for introducing this bill, the private member's bill. I know it was a commitment our government has made, and it was going to be fulfilled. I know Minister McCauley is supportive of this, but I appreciate the fact that you put it forward in a private member's bill so it could be dealt with sooner. As Mr. Carr has referred to, and I'm sure as every member on this committee has, I too have received many, many emails from constituents regarding this bill. And there is great support for banning the export of horses. And very specifically, the concern is about how these animals suffer when they are being transported. You know, I rode horses when I was younger. My daughter is an equestrian. In fact, she was educated at Olds College in Alberta in equestrian studies. And she is not only a rider, a show person, but she also works with horses. And I don't think she would ever transport her show horse by plane. You know, we know these animals have a great instinct, the fight or flight kind of instinct. And when they're stressed in a situation like this, it's very, very difficult for these horses. And in fact, I was thinking about what the member opposite said, that there would be no deaths. And I think choosing a date is nice, but in our Library of Parliament notes that were sent to all of us, it does mention that since 2013, 5 horses have died associated with transportation. So it's, and I had actually reached out to the Library of Parliament to gather information as well. So some horses have died, but more than that, many, I would say all of them suffer. And I think animals are sentient beings. I would agree with that. And while we're not saying people in Canada cannot eat horse meat, we are simply saying that we do not approve of this practice. And I wanted to mention another thing, which is that the UK actually has introduced a much broader bill. It's actually called an animal welfare bill because they are concerned about the welfare of animals, to ban all livestock exports from the UK. And that was introduced in December 2023. Now, again, they're not banning the consumption of animals. They're simply banning the export of these animals because they understand that that is not in the best interests of animal welfare. So there are many reasons. And I did want to introduce one thing that I found disturbing, which is both Mr. Barlow and Mr. Steinley, when they were making the remarks, referred to members of the Métis Nation who do have businesses. Some of them have businesses in this area raising animals for slaughter, to be transported for slaughter on these feedlots. And I appreciate that that is part of their livelihood. And I understand that that is one way that they are making a living. However, referring to their Métis traditions and cultures as though somehow this is consistent with Indigenous culture and tradition, I would object to that because we all know, or we should know if we've looked at Indigenous culture and tradition at all, that a key tenet of animal-Indigenous relationships is respect. And I would sincerely question whether there is a great deal of respect being shown of these magnificent animals when they are bred to be slaughtered at the age of 18 months and to be transported in crates for more than 28 hours without any food or water. I did also want to refer to one other thing, which was a question you had about whether any rules are being broken. Because rules are not necessarily being broken, and in some instances we do not know that because although we have rules, they're often not enforced and they're not checked. Section 146 of the Health of Animals Regulations, which I'm sure Mr. Barlow is familiar with, does prohibit individuals from transporting an animal if it is likely to suffer, sustain an injury, or die. I would suggest that most horses, and if they could talk, I remember Mr. Ed, the talking horse, if these horses could talk, would indicate that they do suffer when they're being transported for 28 hours standing with no food or water, and that often goes longer than that. So as someone who does care about all sentient beings and thinks that we have a responsibility as a government and to our constituents. And once again, I have received thousands of emails from constituents. In fact, one from a woman recently who said she's been waiting 19 years to see this happen, and she's been advocating this for this long. So thank you very much for doing this, and I think it is our job to look at these rules, even if they're not being broken, if they're inadequate to protect the welfare of animals. The one thing I did want to ask you about in particular was some of these, the acts that are meant to protect horses. They fall short of enforcing or even including horses that are raised for slaughter or destined for slaughter by transport for slaughter. For example, the National Farm Animal Care Council published a code of practice for the care and handling of equines, meant to uphold standards for horses on feedlots, but they do not include enforcement or penalties for operators to follow them. And then there's the Horse Welfare Code of Conduct by Equestrian Canada, again, something my daughter belongs to, but they don't even include any horses destined for slaughter. So it seems that horses bred for slaughter often receive less protection. And do you believe that that does translate to a lack of welfare upheld by industry practices?
So, Mr. Lewis, we are, and Ms. Taylor-Roy, I was trying to be generous. We are vastly over time, but Mr. Lewis, if you could quickly summarize, I'll let you go ahead.
I can summarize it by saying I think the length of your question shows your expertise and your care, and appreciate this. And you're not alone. Canadians across the country want this practice to end. So thank you.
Mr. Perron, up to 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Lewis, I'm trying to do this very directly, 2.5 minutes. So the idea is that you're not trying to stop slaughter of horses, but you're trying to stop export by plane because these are sentient beings. But all animals are sentient beings. We transport hogs, we transport veal, calves rather, and chickens, and that is why we've established transportation standards. And this brings me back to what I said earlier. If you do not want us to stop eating horse meat, then what is the purpose of developing a kind of status of noblesse, of nobility for horses? So the idea is that you're simply trying to stop the export of these horses by plane. And I think we mentioned it earlier, we spoke about it, but I think the solution is to look at the transportation standards that exist. So if you don't believe that this will not affect other animal production, do you not believe that this is going to create some kind of precedent? The next time around, we're going to say, well, to transport hogs in a truck, there's wind, we will have to review all of these standards. So why should we not, in that particular case, review all of the standards? So I'm having some trouble following you. I really have trouble following you on that. So perhaps you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. That is the reason that I made this a standalone bill. I did not want, we've had discussions in our committee here about animal transportation, many studies, and that's important that we do that because, again, the CFIA and all of the regulations are making sure animal health is protected, and that happens here in Canada. But this bill is specifically designed to end one specific instance, which is just banning horses for slaughter.
Je m'excuse de vous interrompre là, dans le dernier 30 secondes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but in my last 30 seconds, you're saying the point is not to stop it, but you are stopping one type of transport for one particular type of animal. I think we'll have to review all of this. What about the other animals, the sentient as well? It's important that we note that in the committee, that we will not consider less another animal. But in your introduction, you mentioned the noble status of the horse. So S-266 might be a better solution, no? Because it bans all modes of transport. Would not be a better option?
Other animals are not transported on planes across the world unattended. That's what's happening with these horses in those containers, in those tight spaces with no one looking after them, more than one in a crate, packed away. That's not the way we're doing things here in Canada. Once that plane leaves, there's no accountability, and that's one of the things that this bill intends to stop.
Okay, thank you to you both. We'll now turn to Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just make it brief, Mr. Lewis. One question, just on the points that Mr. Barlow raised. You know, there obviously are some concerns from some sectors of the industry. You know, anytime we make policy changes, it is going to have consequences. What do you think the government's policy should be if this were to become law? What measures could be put in place to alleviate their concerns and maybe help them transition so that they're not having a loss of revenue?
Thank you. That's an important question. And if this bill passes, receives royal assent, there's built in an 18-month implementation. 18 months to implementation. That's going to do a number of things. It's going to also give the chance for the government to respond with whatever regulations they need, to ask the agencies to do what they need to do, to adjust, and it will also give time to account for those horses, because it's 18 months is the lifespan of a horse before it's born and before it's sent off to export by air. So that 18-month grace period will be a time that, and in many legislation does that, comes into effect at a certain date. So, so that we want to make sure we have time to do this correctly.
Great, thank you.
Okay, colleagues, that brings us to the end of our hour. Thank you for the ability to extend a little bit. We will be studying horticulture on Thursday. It is the start of our Health of Horticulture in Canada study. So we will see you bright and early, I guess 11 o'clock on Thursday morning. Thank you, Mr. Lewis, and everyone have a great day. Meeting adjourned.